All right, so welcome back. In this video, we're going to set up the actual project. All of it's number one, its location, where it exists on your drive, to the actual Unity layout in terms of its interface, as well as the folder structure, and start constructing the individual scenes and all that content. So first of all, I'm going to jump over here to my Unity launcher, sorry, the Unity hub, right? In this case, I'm actually using the latest official release, so 2019.1.1 F1, and I'm also using Visual Studio 2019. So the stuff that we're going to work through in this project should work as far as Unity 2018.3 and higher. The reason I say 2018.3 is because Unity changed the way prefabs worked as of that version. So it's going forward, it's the new technique. So if you're using an older version of Unity, like 2018.2 or older, then I highly recommend you update. So what we're going to do is we've been creating our stuff throughout this class in a folder where we're keeping track of our lectures and our week 2 project and that kind of stuff. So I'm going to do effectively the same thing. So right here in my launcher, I'm going to say new. And this project, I'm going to name it, again, according to the instructions document, PGF1 Week 3 Project. You set your preferred version of Unity or whatever one you're targeting. In my case, again, it's 2019.1.1 F1. And it's going to ask, where do you want to put this particular project? Now, as I mentioned before, we have originally set up a location where we were holding on to our lectures and our week 2 project and that kind of stuff. So in this case, I'm going to keep building in that particular folder. So I'm going to select the folder that I've got. If you've got your own layout, go ahead and stick with that, but this is mine. So I'm going to select that folder, make sure it's there. And even though this project, when we look at it here in just a second, in terms of the reference material, even though it looks like and was originally a 2D project, we're going to keep it in 3D because Unity is a 3D engine, but we're going to do some tricks with the camera to basically flatten everything out. And so we'll use 3D here. I'm not going to use analytics. There's no reason for it. And I'm not going to add any asset packages if you have either of those two options. So I'm going to go ahead and create the project. And Unity is going to take just a second to start constructing that. While it's doing that, I'm going to jump back over here to my sandbox, while it's doing that, I'm going to jump back over here to my week 3 project and take a look at the 3.1.1 instructions and settings. So in this document, we had scrolled down just a second ago, so I'm going to zip back up here to the top. We're going to walk through these individual construction phases. So we just had Unity create our 3D project named PGF1 Week 3 Project, and we'll come back to this deleting stuff here in just a second. But we're gonna jump over phase 2 for just a second and come down here to phase 3. Now phase 3 is where we're going to pick up some key information about what this project actually entails. So you'll notice the first thing is this link out to Wikipedia to Arkanoid, and if we go there, what you'll notice is it's basically history of the game and some different versions and that kind of stuff. So we're going to be reproducing this game right here based on this beginning level. So several things to take away from this general bit of information. A, its name, Arkanoid, spelled just like that. There's some information in here about what the actual story of the game is. So turns out your ship is trying to escape from this crash. And so the idea here is we're going to name our game Voss Escape. So it's your ship, the Voss, and it's trying to escape. So the other piece of information is this image down here. We're going to try to reproduce most of this layout as well as where things currently live. And the third piece is over here on the right-hand side, down at the bottom, we have display. Now, this tells us what the original UI looked like in terms of its resolution on the original hardware. And in this case, it was 224 by 256. Well, that would be about the size of a postage stamp on most of our current systems. So what I'm going to do is scale this up by a factor of 4, and that'll get us a pretty good kind of modern day ratio. So when we go working through the calculations and setting up our UI and that kind of stuff, that's the reasoning behind that, taking 224 by 256 and scaling it up by 4 times. Okay, so, but what I do need to do, according to the instructions over here, is grab myself a copy of this image, and we'll pull that into our project and continue working. So what I'm going to do is jump back over here to the Arkanoid Wikipedia page, and this image over here, if I click on it, we'll see this looks correct, and over here we have a download button. So we're going to download this file, original, again right here, 224 by 256. I'm going to download that over to, in this case, I'm just going to throw it onto my desktop. And that takes like a split second to download. It's a very small file. And here, because we're talking about attribution and copyright and that kind of stuff, I'm actually not going to use this as part of the final game. It's strictly for laying out where my items exist. Once we get everything kind of laid out, then I'll shut it off. It shouldn't be part of the final version of the game. So now what I'm going to do is effectively walk through a lot of these steps now that Unity has finished building our project over here. So on my other screen, I've got this document pulled up. So as I'm walking through this, I'll call out every phase and every step that we're working through. But essentially, we're going to spend pretty much the rest of this video as well as the series in either Visual Studio or Unity. So now that we're over here in our project, you'll notice this is the default project that Unity provides to us. The default layout is such that your hierarchy is over here on the left, your project is down here on the bottom, console, and the inspector is way over here on the right. It also nests, get rid of that asset store, there we go. It also nests the scene and game views right here in the center. So as you kind of jump back and forth, oops, let me reset that. So we kind of jump back and forth. And what I want to do is basically, as I'm clicking on different items over here in my hierarchy, and as I'm creating stuff down here in my project and kind of dragging it back and forth and changing stuff over here in the inspector, that's a lot of distance my mouse has to cover, especially if you're dealing with like a trackpad and you don't have a mouse. This can get a little irritating, right? So the idea here is Unity is a tool that you will probably be using. It's your go-to, your daily driver, your bread, it's the tool of your trade. It's your bread and butter tool. So you want to kind of get comfortable with moving different items around. So there's a really great listing of documentation over on Unity's website about moving, customizing the interface and that kind of stuff. But in order to get this thing a little bit more friendly to what we're building, I'm going to kind of move some of these windows around just a little bit, right? You can mouse over some of these splitters, and you can also, remember, you can click and drag off these tabs and move them to different locations. So for starters, I want to take my hierarchy and get it much closer to my inspector. And as you move your window around, right now if I let go, it's just going to be floating, right? It's not docked to anything. But if I bring it closer to some areas, it might try to, or it will try to dock. So in this case, I'm going to dock it right up against the inspector and pull that over. So I now have, a little bit more working room over here. I'm going to take the game view and undock it, kind of pull it over here and dock it right up against hierarchy. That way these two windows are kind of side by side. I can see into the scene view and I can see into the game view while working in these other windows. And by the way, Unity refers to these as views, scene, and game because you're actually seeing, you're viewing into the world, right, into your level, into your scene. But over here, the hierarchy, inspector, console, project, those are all windows. And by the way, if you accidentally delete these windows or these views and you want to get them back, again, those are all listed right up here under window. And most of them are in general, but then there are other tabs that have, other menu items that have other listings. So, I encourage you to explore Unity and explore the documentation to find more of this kind of stuff out. So now I'm going to take the project window, kind of detach it, navigate across here. I want to put it just underneath my hierarchy. Now, I'd rather these two kind of be more vertical, right? Take up a little bit more space along this column right alongside my inspector. So I'm going to take my console, and this is going to take a little bit of finessing to actually get it correct, but if I break it free and then move it down here to the bottom, let's see, it's going to try to dock over here. And then if I pull game back over, granted everything moved around a little bit, but now I can move my windows back, and now I've got a little bit more working area with my project. And the reason I'm doing this is because this hierarchy is actually going to grow, and I don't want to necessarily be collapsing things and expanding them, as well as down here. Now, it's also worth noting that when you're building stuff in a similar kind of style to the hierarchy, you might lose content down here. Like, just by looking at this one view right now, you don't know that there's actually a scene inside that scenes folder. You would only find that out by clicking on the scenes folder. I personally am not a fan of that. It hides stuff. It's way too easy to forget that something was there. And as you're creating stuff in Unity, if you have a specific folder selected, and let's say you've added a component, remember, Unity will create that right there at your root, at your assets folder. So to find your assets, you'd have to remember to click on assets and then see your script or whatever sitting right there. Again, I'm not a huge fan of this potential for losing files and having them hidden in other subdirectories. Also, we don't really need this favorites, right? We're not going to search for specific things. So in this case, what I want to do is basically change the mode of project. And to do that, I want to, up here where it says project in its tab, I want to right click. And instead of being two column, which is this left column and this right column, I want to switch this to a mode that looks a lot more similar to the hierarchy, right? It's this, we have all of our items. If there's content under it, we'll get this little disclosure triangle right here that we can expand and collapse. So I'm going to right click on project and go to one column layout. And now notice we can see that there is an arrow here, and yes, there is content under that, otherwise that arrow wouldn't be there. So it's a very quick way to identify that there is something there without having to actually click on it. And as I continue growing this project, I'm actually going to keep all these things expanded. That way we can keep an eye on what's where in our project. So now that we've got this layout, assuming that you wanted to save this, all you'd have to do is come up here to Layout and click Save Layout, give it a name, and click Save. Now I've already done this. I already have my own favorite layout for Unity, which I called main. Yours won't have this unless you save yours as main as well. But essentially, when I reset this, watch what happens. Unity goes away, comes right back, and the interface is basically the same because this is, again, the layout that I wanted. Unfortunately, it kind of collapses this first item. So now that we've got the layout so that we can, again, as we're clicking on items here in the project, here in the hierarchy, our inspector is immediately right here next to us. So we don't have to really go anywhere to start working on these things. Our mouse doesn't have to travel. And down here, now we have the console front and center. We're able to see any kind of warnings or errors or informational logs, debug.log, without having to kind of hunt for it, right? The console is active. It's not occluded by any other views or windows. So the next phase, the next step in phase 2, right? We downloaded the image from phase 3, now we're back at phase 2. The next step in phase 2 is to go through and basically clean out Unity. Now Unity, it's nice, it's generous, it gave us a sample scene with a camera and a light, but it turns out this is actually going to cause an issue later on when we go to try to test our scene, because Unity is tracking some stuff behind the scenes for this scene, but not the actual name. So if you accidentally, and by the way, this information is listed in step number 4, if you accidentally keep in your test project, if you keep the name or the scene named sample scene around, Unity will spot that those two scenes, the one we have right now, if we started constructing in it, sees that that scene, as well as the one inside your inside your test project, they're identical. They have the same ID. So it basically will, even though you rename your scene, Unity will undo that change. And since our code is going to a specifically named scene, that can cause issues, right? You press the play button and you get an error. So we don't want that to happen. In other words, we need to clean out Unity and start from scratch, right? So first of all, in order to unload this scene, all I need to do is press Control-N on the keyboard. It's the same as going up to File, New Scene. And when you create a new scene, it unloads whatever one you're currently in and gives you this untitled scene. But we still have this sample scene and the scenes folder down here in Assets. Now, I don't want that. I don't want it to stick around. So I'm going to click on Scenes and delete. Unity is going to warn me that this action cannot be undone. That's fine. We don't need this scene ever again. So we're going to hit delete. So now, underneath Assets, we want to create the folder structure to make sure that this project is properly organized. So from Assets, I want to right-click and up here at the top say Create and then say Folder. That's going to provide me a new folder, and Unity lets me rename it. Now, if I click off of that and I can't rename it again, basically, if it's already selected, if you wait for, the idea is with Windows, if you double-click something, it usually opens it. If you click it once and pause for about a quarter to a half second and then click it again, it automatically goes into rename mode. You can also click on it and press F2 on your keyboard, or right-click and go up to Rename. So this item, I want you to name this your last name, your first name, underscore week 3 project. So that will be last name Reynolds, first name Tony, underscore week 3 project. And you'll notice I'm not using any spaces other than the underscore to separate the two sets of words. So this will help us stay organized and make grading a little bit more sane later on. Now, underneath this root level folder, I want to create all of my subfolders that are going to organize all my content. Now, this project is going to be made up of several scenes, several scripts, several materials. We're going to turn a bunch of our assets into prefabs. That way we can reuse them later on in other scenes. And then we have our image that we just pulled from the internet a second ago, that Arkanoid visual, and I want to turn it into a sprite at some point. So here on our named underscore week 3 project folder, I want to right click and go up to Create Folder. Now again, according to Phase 4, I've got several named folders in here, in terms of their individual assets. So instead of doing that right-click, create folder every single time, what I'm going to do is press Enter, and then use Control-D to duplicate that new folder. And there are, according to the Phase 2 document, and again, every time I call out this Phase 2, if you want to just pause the video and jump back over to the document and look at what I'm referring to, in this case, we've just renamed everything, and we're going to be creating these 4 named folders. Okay, so if we jump back over to Unity, with this folder, there are going to be a total of 5 unique items. So if we Control-D 4 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, you'll notice Unity is providing us these numbers as well. So I want to pick one of those 5 folders, go into rename mode, and the first one, we're going to follow in sequence of the document. So the first one is going to be Scenes. Pick one of the 4 remaining new folders and rename. And the next one is going to be Scripts. From one of the 3 remaining, rename. And we want Materials. And one of the 2, let's go with Prefabs. Prefabricated objects that we can reuse later on. And then the last item we're going to rename to Sprites. So at this point, now that we've got our folders for organizing our scenes, our assets rather, we want to turn this untitled scene into an actual asset down here. So if we do Control S, which is the same as going up to File, Save, Unity is going to ask, where do we want to put this scene file? So we're already inside our current project, inside the assets folder, right here at the root. So we want to drill into our last name, first name underscore week 3 project folder. And in here, we're saving a scene, right? We can see down here, it's what type to save. It's a .unity file, which is a Unity scene. And that, we're going to go into this scenes folder. And we need to give it some kind of name. Now, the name that I'm going to pick for this scene is going to be level space 01. And then click save or hit enter. And now notice, because we have just saved a scene, we get the little disclosure triangle right here next to this scenes folder. And if we click on that, we see, hey, right there is our level 1. So far, so good. So now we can return to phase 3. So we talked just a second ago, right? We just saved the scene. We talked just a second ago about the fact that we pulled this image from the Arkanoid Wikipedia page. Now we want to bring that into our project and actually do some stuff with it. So if we go back to Unity, well, number one, that image is over on my desktop, so I need to bring it into this project somehow. I'm going to open up a new Windows Explorer window, an Explorer window, I guess. And to do that, I want to press and hold the Windows key, followed by the E key. E is in Echo. And this will bring up the Explorer. And if I double click into my desktop, right there is our file. So if I move this over just a little bit so I can see both it and my Unity project, if I drag and drop this image over here onto my sprites folder, right? Watch where you're placing it. If you put it right here or right here, that line indicates it's going to go between those two folders, which means it's going to be part of this root folder. But if you put your cursor right on the folder and the folder is selected, it'll go right there. So release your mouse and it'll put that item right back into that location. Now, since this image is going to be our layout, I basically want to rename this to kind of convey what its purpose is. So again, rename mode, or F2, and then Arkanoid space layout is going to be its name. So if you try to take just an image like this and you try to add it to your scene, because we started creating this project as a 3D project, that configured certain aspects of the editor to basically assume that all the textures, all the images you bring in are going to be textures. And the idea is a texture is applied through a material applied to an object. Well, that's not actually what we're doing here. We want this item to be a sprite, right? Part of our kind of UI so we can lay stuff out. So if you try to take the Arkanoid layout as it exists right now and try to drag it into the scene, try to drop it onto stuff over here in the scene, here in the hierarchy, it's not going to work. You're going to get that no symbol right there over your mouse. So in order to use this, we have to change its type. And just as an aside, if you are working with a 2D project and you accidentally picked 3D, you can always go up here to Edit, Project Settings, and in this window, you're going to have a number of different settings about the actual project. We can configure a bunch of different things. But since we want to change the way the editor would behave in that kind of situation, right here under Editor, if you click that, you'll notice down here about halfway down we see the default behavior mode, and the mode is currently 3D. All that hub button did when we created that new project was picked one of these two. Now what that's going to do behind the scenes is if you bring in things like textures, it's going to think you want to apply those through materials. If you bring in textures and it's in 2D mode, they'll automatically be converted to sprites. That setting will also change the way the scene view over here works. It's going to automatically be in 2D right? In this kind of orthographic looking down the Z behavior, and your camera is also going to be configured slightly differently. So it basically configures stuff to be more of a 2D kind of project. But in this case, since we're dealing with 3D, all we need to do is change this image, its behavior, its mode. So with it selected over here in the inspector, right up here at the top where it says texture type default, we want to change that to be right down here, sprite, 2D and UI. So when you click that default, you come through here and select sprite, 2D and UI. Now that's going to move some of these settings around. It hides some, it gives you some more. And the idea here is, Unity customizes itself based on what you're trying to do. And now in order to make that change permanent, in order to commit it, we have to apply it. So down here at the very bottom, you're going to see two buttons, revert and apply. If you click revert, it will undo any changes you've just made. If you click apply, it's going to commit that change, but then it's also, notice over here, we now get a little disclosure triangle right next to our sprite. And the telltale sign of a sprite in Unity is this extra little layout information that the engine uses. So now that we've got this thing as a sprite, we can actually try to bring it into our level. Now if I try to put it over here in my scene, watch what happens. It just kind of allows me to put it anywhere in my scene, kind of perpendicular to my camera's plane. And I don't really want that because that's just kind of out there anywhere. What I want to do is actually put it over here inside my hierarchy. Now when I do that, just not attached to anything specific, just right here in the hierarchy, when I do put it there like that, it will automatically go to a reset transform. And remember, best practice when you're creating objects in Unity, your hierarchy, unless you have a specific reason to put it somewhere, then you should reset your transform. And if you happen to have a different transform, remember you can either type in manually 000 and so on, or just hit that gear and say reset, and it resets everything. Okay? So now that that image is out there, it kind of starts looking like, okay, well, we can start to see if we scale this up a little bit. Maybe we've got some good information. So it turns out for this particular image, scaling it up by 4 isn't really going to be a good visual. It's actually going to clip on some of the edges. So what I want to do, just for this image only, everything else is going to work fine, but just for this image, I want to scale it up by 3.9. And I only want to do that in the X and the Y because this is a flat plane. It doesn't have a Z value. So, or there is no Z scale. So right here with the Arkanoid layout selected, I want to choose Scale X and change this to 3.9. And I also want to change the Y, the scale Y, to 3.9 as well. Now this height issue and this extra area around the sides, we'll fix that shortly. When we start manipulating the camera and start adjusting some other aspects of this project, those will get fixed. But for now, all we needed to do was put it in our scene at origin with a scale in the X and Y of 3.9. Okay, so far so good. Now, when we go to play test this game later, what we're gonna find is that if you we're not going to do it for this class, but if you made a build of the game, we would want to enforce this aspect ratio, right? We're trying to, this resolution. We're trying to keep this resolution at a specific size to keep the original feel of the original game. So the idea is if the player can resize your window, it might break the way the look and feel is. Also, with a Unity project, oftentimes when you very first start playing it, you'll get this little pop-up it's a resolution picker dialog. And in this case, we actually don't want to see that dialog. We want to reinforce our 224 by 256 multiplied by 4. We want to enforce that as our resolution. So in order to do that, we need to make a couple of adjustments to the player should you make a build. So notice up here underneath the game view, I have this free aspect dropdown. Now, if you go looking down through here, you're going to notice these first few items that have a colon between them. These are aspect ratios. But then down here under standalone, there's an X between the two numbers. That is a resolution. So the idea here is you can pick some kind of preset and model your UI based on some kind of a reference point. Now, this class is not a class in designing UIs or anything like that, so we're not going to dive deep into any of that stuff. But realize that right here, standalone, and then these values, 1024 by 768, that comes from the player setting. And it turns out, in order to make an adjustment to those values, so I'm going to go ahead and pick that. So notice how our screen changes size. If I picked, let's say, 16 by 9, it goes to a different aspect ratio. Let's pick that standalone resolution, 10 by 7. Okay. So now I want to adjust this so it kind of gets rid of that extra space around the edges. These settings are listed under Edit, Project Settings, and then we need to go down to the Player. Now, if your UI looks a little different, there's a possibility that Unity has changed some of these settings. They usually tend to consolidate settings. Realize that the setting it's not necessarily gone, especially if it's like fundamental to most programs, but realize that some of these platforms are only here because maybe I've got them installed elsewhere, or maybe you've got more installed, so you might have different options in here. But essentially, we're, by default, you can see it right here in the title bar, we're configured to be PC, Mac, and Linux standalone. Now, that platform that you're targeting is also listed under, if you go to File and Build Settings, this tells us what platform we're currently targeting. The little Unity logo over here indicates that platform. And if you've got other things installed like iOS or Android or so on and so forth, by picking these, your UI here will change to reflect that specific platform. You've got specific settings. But in this case, we're only dealing with the PC standalone. So that little down arrow is what indicates PC, Mac, and Linux standalone. There's iOS, there's Android, there's that web player, and so on and so forth. Now, according to Phase 3 over in our documentation, we need to make some modifications to the resolution and presentation. So here's resolution and presentation. We don't want it to be full screen. So if you come over here to full screen window and change that to windowed down at the bottom, you'll notice the UI shifts a little bit. And now we have the default screen width and height. So if I move my window just a little bit so we can see the standalone 1024 by 768 up here, I said that we want to use 224 by 256, but we want to multiply those up by 4. So it turns out if you find yourself talking to one of these little boxes here and it deals with numbers, Unity behind the scenes will actually do math for you. So 224 times 4 is 896. 256 times 4 is 1024. So the target numbers that we want in these two boxes right here are 896 and 1024. But if we don't want to calculate that, jump out to calculator, type it in, or just, if you want to run those numbers in your head, great. But I'm going to let Unity do the heavy lifting for me. So right here where it has 1024, I'm going to just type in 224 asterisk, remember that's the multiply, and then 4. Now if I hit enter or tab to jump to the next item, it will automatically do that multiply. And so the next item, and by the way, I'm using either Shift Tab or Tab to jump between those. The height, we said a second ago, was 256 times 4. And if we tab off of that, we get 1024 plugged in. Now, the final piece of this puzzle is down here underneath standalone player options. We have display resolution dialog. At the moment, oh, nice. Okay, so it's already disabled. So if yours doesn't say disabled, go ahead and pick disabled to shut it off. And now, if you notice up here where it said standalone, remember earlier it said 1024 by 768? Now it says our 896 by 1024 because these two numbers pull directly from these two spots right here. Okay? So I'm going to close this window just by I'm actually middle clicking on these tabs to close them out, but if you don't have that button on your mouse, you can always right click and close tab. So now notice we're getting much closer to our target resolution on this image. The only problem here is that if you make you start running the code, you make a build of your game, there's always the possibility there might be some edge case where the player is able to resize it. So we actually want to reinforce this with code. Now the idea here is that if your game had something like a resolution dialog or full screen versus windowed mode, there's a class in Unity that lets you control many of those features. And so I'll show you code that allows you to carry on with that particular feature. The other factor is that when we go to test this game later on in our test project, there are certain settings that do not carry over. We as instructors already know about this. So when you go to play test your game, if you forget about this, don't worry, we won't. We already know that all of the scenes that we're constructing, that scene list is not actually carried over. Since you're creating a brand new project, you actually won't have those extra settings because you're creating a new project. And remember, I'm going up here to Edit, Project Settings. These project settings are unique per project. So your test project will have completely unique settings compared to this week 3, this PGF1 week 3 project right here. So realizing that these settings are unique kind of drives us to make a couple of design decisions. Where are we going to update some things, or how are we going to test them later on? So going up here to File, Build Settings, this Scenes in Build, for Unity to run your game and actually play your levels, all of your levels have to be listed in this window right here. Now we'll add those as we continue building stuff later on, but realize that we as instructors are going to rebuild this list when we go to grade. So, and if you made a build of your game, that build would actually contain those scenes. But your test project, because it's a new project, won't have those settings. So don't sweat it when you get to this point. We'll see some of the issues that pop up here in just a minute. But essentially, since those items aren't pulled over, we also find that these numbers here, 896 and 1024, they also get reset. Because remember, the player settings are unique to every project. So in order to kind of keep the editor, just like our layouts up here, we can actually tell the editor itself, so between projects, even the test project later on, we can tell it to use a specific setting whenever we create a new project. So here underneath the game view again, right where we had our standalone, all that information, you'll notice down here at the very bottom of that drop down is a little plus. Well, if you click that plus, you'll get the ability to add a new item. So if you go through and type in Arkanoid, then you have the option to pick either an aspect ratio or a resolution. If you pick aspect ratio, notice we get that colon between the two numbers. Or if you pick resolution, you get the X between the two numbers, basically mimicking a lot of the info you see up here. And then you can manually set in your numbers, in this case, your 896 by 1024. And then when you hit OK, it will be listed right here in this listing. Now, if you potentially made an error here, right? You named it wrong, or you put in the wrong numbers, you can always right-click on the entry and go to Edit, and you get a similar dialog, and you can fix the name, fix the resolution or aspect ratio, and then fix the numbers if you need to, and then hit OK, and it'll commit those. It's worth noting that these values that we're seeing through here, these aspect ratios and this resolution, are because we're targeting PC, Mac, Linux standalone. If we switched over to iOS, these would actually read more like iPhones and iPads. It'll actually tell you the different resolutions for those different devices. Android, it'll do the same thing based on how those devices describe their resolution and that kind of stuff. So just realize that this list can actually change. And so now what I'm going to do is, instead of relying on standalone, which will change later on when we test, I'm actually going to switch over and use this Arkanoid 896 by 1024. So all you have to do is click it. And all that happened there, that little kind of jump you saw, was because our scale changed just a little bit. So between these two screens, if they're the same scale, then we don't see any kind of change. So here we're using Arkanoid. You see that little check right next to it. Okay. So that pretty much concludes all the stuff for phase 3. Now there is also, by the way, while we're working on this kind of stuff, you don't want to go too long writing code or updating stuff in Unity without saving. So that little asterisk right there and right there in your title bar, if you see that, it's an indication that you need to save. So I'm going to Control S to save those various changes. Now, if we jump back over to the document and take a look, you'll notice that that pretty much concludes all the stuff for phase 3. Now, I mentioned that we also want to be able to enforce or reinforce that specific setup using code. So we're going to jump into phase 4 in the next video. So I'll see you in just a second.